This is a program about 4 Australian musical comedies. The music playing behind me is the overture from The Highwayman, written by Edmund Samuels, one of those few adventurous Australians who have dared to write a local product to compete with the imports from overseas. How many listeners, I wonder, know this music as well as My Fair Lady, say, or Oklahoma? More of The Highwayman in a moment. Let's look first at a successful Australian musical of the 30s, Collits Inn by Varney Monk.
Varney Monk is a composer who's always been fascinated by Australian history. It was inevitable that she would incorporate this fascination into her music. Collits Inn represents the flowering of this old obsession into a splendid Australian musical comedy. The true life story of Pierce Collits and his inn at the foot of the Blue Mountains had interested Varney since before the First World War, an interest which was intensified by a holiday spent at the inn itself in 1917. 13 years later, this interest was reawakened by the announcement of a competition to find a new operetta. Varney Monk approached Stuart Gurr and told him the tale of Collits and his inn. Fired by her enthusiasm, Gurr constructed an original book on this idea, and Varney added the words and music. Their operetta won the competition and was produced for a week at Sydney's Adyar Hall with Renee Maxwell and Ambrose Burke in the leading roles. Howard Carr edited and orchestrated the music and conducted these performances. Shortly afterwards, Carr was going on a trip to Melbourne, and Varney urged him to try and interest entrepreneur Frank Thring in their show. This Carr did, and soon there was a full-scale audition of the music arranged in Melbourne.
So Mr. Thring sent for me, and I had a temperature of about 103, but I was going anyway, and I had a good friend with a wonderful voice, and she said, "You're not going without me," so off we went. And when we got there, the audition was in the Palais at St Kilda, and Mr. Thring sat there with his wife and daughter. Thank God there were no critics. And he had a very good orchestra, and Alan Eddy and my friend Philippa, they sang some of the songs. Well, he came over towards me, and in that split second, I knew he was going to take it, and all I thought was, I do hope it brings you some good back.
Once accepted by Thring, the casting was settled, and the inevitable rewriting began. Jock McLeod and Charles Wah were just 2 of the hands who supplied new lyrics. George Wallace was to have the principal comedy role, and that meant special material from him too. For the first time in Australia, a revolving stage would allow the action to flow from indoors to outdoors without scene blackouts. About 1925, Varney had met in Kiama, New South Wales, Queen Rosie, the last full-blooded Aboriginal of the Illawarra tribe, and had transcribed with some difficulty on a music stave sketched out on a handy piece of paper a chant in praise of the moon and stars sung by the old Aboriginal woman. This melody was orchestrated by Harry Jacobs and incorporated into Collits Inn. For Thring's production of the show, it became an accompaniment to a spectacular native corroboree, which was choreographed by Jenny Brennan. Gradually, you see, the threads were being drawn together. Thring engaged Gladys Moncrief on a year's contract to play the leading female role of Mary Collits, and Robert Chisholm, who'd been Beppo in the original production of The Maid of the Mountains, came back from London after 6 years away to play Ensign Lake, with whom Mary falls in love. Marshall Crosby played Pierce Collits, Burl Walkley was Mistress Dale, Claude Fleming produced and also played the important role of Keane the bushranger, and John Dobby and George Wallace took care of the comedy. At last all was ready for opening night, the Princess Melbourne, December 23rd, 1933.
Well, the opening night, my husband and the children came down, and we drove into Spring Street, and there I saw all the theatre lit up, Collits Inn, and of course I thought, oh well, I must have arrived. Then I began to be frightened about Mr. Thring, whether he'd lose money or whether it was going to be a success or not. So my husband said to me, "You're a funny woman, you don't seem excited." Anyhow, when we got inside, of course, it was quite wonderful, and everybody was expectant, you know, for the new venture, Mr. Thring, for the first time, the revolving stage, all the Australian atmosphere that had never been done before. And when the curtain went up and all the redcoats marching through the bush, it was a wonderful sight.
The reviews were very good indeed. Amongst the praise, a few quibbles, of course. Table Talk found the happy ending tacked on, rather, and thought George Wallace gagged a bit too much. The Argus experienced some difficulty in following the plot and didn't care much for the words of one of the songs, but admitted that these were comparative trifles. Amongst the praise, everyone was delighted with Glad's singing, and Chisholm was well received in the romantic lead. After almost 4 months in Melbourne, Collits Inn had a gala opening at the Tivoli, Sydney on June the 22nd, 1934. Even before its Melbourne opening, the show had been adapted for broadcasting over the ABC, and it was done subsequently a couple of times in later years. In 1951, the Mossman Musical Society in Sydney revived Collits Inn, as did the Nepean Musical Society in 1963 to mark the sesquicentenary of the crossing of the Blue Mountains. Perhaps one day we might have a fully professional revival of this rare theatrical event, a truly Australian musical comedy.
Trees in blossom, roses in bud, willows are tenderly green. Wonderful springtime brings back again beauties that mock me, memories that fade. For last year we trod these self-same paths that now I tread alone. Last year your kisses on my lips, would that I never had known. Spring days are just as sweet may be, the skies perhaps as blue, but all of these memories now fill me with sadness. Well, last year I wandered with you. For last year we trod these self-same paths that now I tread alone. Last year your kisses on my lips, would that I never had known. Spring days are just as sweet may be, the skies perhaps as blue, but all of these memories now fill me with sadness. Well, last year I wandered with you.
That charming song, Last Year, was the hit of Collits Inn. Varney Monk herself has made this recording of it at the piano.
programme called Collits Inn the beginning of a new era. Those bright hopes got rather tarnished as the years went by, but in December 1933, the future of Australian musical comedy seemed encouragingly bright.
At least it may be added that Barney Monk went on to write The Cedar Tree for the professional stage. Yet the whole musical comedy story, which I've come to know from producing a series of that name, is literally littered with forgotten shows. I'm continually amazed at the number of overseas musicals by established writers like Rodgers and Hart, Jerome Kern, Sigmund Romberg, and many others which are either unknown or forgotten. It's scarcely surprising then that writers in Australia rarely get beyond the status of the semi-professional. Indeed, why do they want to write Australian musicals at all? This is what Edmund Samuels says.
Over a period of time, I always had the idea I'd like to write an Australian musical, and this goes back a very long time. I even went to London in 1936 for the same idea. And I was told in London by the chief of Drury Lane that he didn't think the English would like the Australian scene on the stage. Of course, that made me very interested and anxious to see that I did get it on the stage, which I eventually did. The Highwayman is essentially an Australian play about gold mining, colourful and musical.
How did you come to choose the subject itself? Where did you get the story from?
Well, I've always been associated with this kind of thing, having been born in a small country town, New England, where they used to find gold. I always had little nuggets of gold, little curios that miners gave me. Then I'd been to the various mines, one thing and another, and then I saw Bendigo and Ballarat, and the idea occurred to me, why not the 1860 period? It was very colourful, it was very interesting, and it's something really to do with Australia.
Good luck came to me this morning. Fate has dealt a winning hand. When I set out with the dawning at the head of the robbers' band. Through my life I always have been scheming. That's a carefree lover's way. And now I've realized my dreaming. So now I can be on my way. Farewell to the mountains, with regret I'm leaving. Goodbye to my comrades, for I must away. Farewell, I'll be going where the love light's flowing, into bright eyes glowing, turning night to day. So when love calls, lovers must away. That's why I am leaving you today. Goodbye to the mountains, for I must bid you farewell. Farewell, the mountains, with regret I'm leaving. Oh, goodbye, my comrades, for I must away. Farewell, I'll be going. I say farewell to you all, my glory. I must away. Bright eyes glowing. Goodbye to you. Goodbye today. Oh, when love comes, lovers must obey. That's why I am leaving us today. Goodbye to the mountains. I must bid you farewell.
John West, what do you recall of The Highwayman on stage?
The Highwayman had its Australian premiere on November the 18th, 1950 at the King's Theatre, Melbourne. Its composer, Edmund Samuels, had not only written the book and lyrics as well, but also founded the company that staged the show. I saw this production a couple of months after it opened and made a note about it in my programme at the time. Ingenuous, but tuneful, which just about sums up my recollections of it. Here again, nearly 20 years after Collits Inn, were bushrangers, an Australian historical setting, a corroboree, and a colonial governor taking part in the action. The ingredients of an Australian musical comedy don't seem to change much. Performances in The Highwayman were quite attractive. Beryl Seaton made a pleasant heroine. Earl Covert, an American, borrowed from J.C. Williamson's Annie Get Your Gun, was a good, robust hero, and Beth Nicol and Charles Norman kept the fun bubbling. Carl Randall, another loan from the firm, was the show's director. Once again, we read in the programme, The Highwayman is of tremendous importance to the future of the Australian legitimate theatre. As it turned out, it wasn't, which is rather a pity.
The goldfields in the late 19th century, one would think, have a fatal attraction for writers of Australian musicals. For we look next at Lola Montez. Lola has music by Peter Stannard, lyrics by Peter Benjamin, and a book by Alan Burke. Alan Burke has recalled how they started the project.
I met Peter Benjamin and Peter Stannard, who were both at Sydney University at the time, and jointly writing songs for university reviews. I'd been doing much the same thing in Melbourne. Oddly enough, was Lloyd Thompson, who turned out later to be one of the collaborators on the Sentimental Bloke. I was in Sydney, and we all met. And later I moved to live in Sydney. We discussed the possibility of all getting together, writing a musical. And it took till the end of '56 for this to happen, a matter of some 5 or 6 years after the meeting. And we had the subject of Lola Montez in our minds, mainly because good, well-known international figure in her own right, the fact that she'd been on our goldfields and created a bit of a stir, seemed a good subject for a lyrical treatment. And we all sat down towards the end of '56, and in about 3 months had finished a very rough draft of the play, which we submitted to the Elizabethan Trust, who were very interested and asked us to finish it. And within about a year of that, we were on at the Union Theatre in Melbourne, which was the original tryout of Lola. And from there, Hugh Hunt took up the option to stage it at the Elizabethan Theatre, which happened towards the end of 1958.
The Goldfields theme seems to be certainly a popular one.
Yes, well, I think for many reasons. It's a good broad canvas. It's very distinctive in that it's got very strong associations with Australian feeling and the sort of growth of an Australian philosophy. I think this has a lot to do with it. Sort of the big freedom drive and Eureka and all that.
Is there any one of the songs in the show that you would regard as a highlight?
Well, the song that took most years, I think, in Lola Montez was Saturday Girl, which grew out of a very simple plan. It wasn't regarded as a high spot in the show in any way. To this day, Peter Stannard, who wrote the music, doesn't especially like it. But during the rehearsals in Melbourne at the first production, we found the cast were whistling it and, you know, took it very much to their hearts, with the result that we wrote in a reprise of it in the show to cover a rather nasty scene change. And from there on, it went to do quite well, not right to the top of the local hit parade charts. So we have a very strong affection for that one.
Tomorrow's Saturday. Why don't you miss your poetry reading? I'll tell you poetry better than you'll read in any old book.
No, Daniel.
Oh, please, I've come...
Halfway round the world, yes, I know. But let's not get ahead of ourselves, Daniel.
Oh, no, Jane. You've got to promise me. Be my Saturday girl, and the hours will fly in a whirl till a whole sweet thing has gone flying and whirling completely away. Be my Saturday girl, and the sun is sure to rise early and go down late, for he'll know I've a long time to wait. Each Sunday to Friday will seem to take ages to go. Then it'll be my day and go like a moment or so. Be my Saturday girl, and it's all I'll ask of the world till you share my life as my Sunday to Saturday wine.
You
street or town or up or down, it's all the same to me. Please, you've got to tell me what your answer is to be.
No, Daniel, let me repeat. Wait and see.
Be my Saturday girl, and it's all I'll ask of the world, till you share my life as my Sunday to Saturday wife. My Sunday to Saturday
It's notable that Lola Montez established the longest single run of any show at Sydney's Elizabethan Theatre. A comment, please, John West.
Lola Montez was the first Australian musical to be presented by the Elizabethan Theatre Trust. The show was tried out by the Union Repertory Company of Melbourne, and subsequently, after expansion, it saw the footlights of a full-scale theatre in Brisbane and in October 1958 in Sydney. Lola Montez has a lot of claims to be our most successful musical to date. It was crafted with care, obviously in the style of current Broadway hits. It had a slickness and professionalism about it which made it rewarding, and musically it was very strong indeed. It was a kind of colonial paint-your-wagon. It was not, however, ideally cast. Mary Preston looked absurdly young for the age she was supposed to be, and Eric Thornton, whom I saw as Daniel, the idealistic miner who becomes infatuated with Lola, didn't look the very young man he was supposed to be. It was interesting and much more effective to see the age balance corrected in the later ABC television version of the show. Frank Wilson was clever as Sam, Lola's manager, and Jane Martin looked pretty in the conventionally written part of Daniel's girlfriend. Writing in the program, Hugh Hunt said, "The authors have, I believe, succeeded in writing a musical which might well have an international appeal." Unfortunately, it hadn't.
When Albert Arlen made The Sentimental Bloke into a musical in 1961, critics said, "At last Australia has its own smash hit musical comedy." Of course, it was based on a smash hit book of verse, which had previously been on the stage as a play and a ballet, and in the cinema as a silent film and a talkie. For purists, the new lyrics were not as attractive as the C.J. Dennis originals. But then the musical version of The Bloke wasn't intended simply as a replica of the original, was it, Albert Arlen?
Now, that's a very interesting question, because the characters that we have in the musical are not all Dennis. We manufactured a lot of these people, with the exception of Rose, Doreen, the Bloke, and Ginger Mick. They are the only characters that belong to the original Sentimental Bloke poems. The rest were invented by the writers Lloyd Thompson and Nancy Brown, who wrote the book and the lyrics. It's very much the same as the same effort as My Fair Lady. A lot of that is not actually Bernard Shaw. It was the work of the authors Lerner and Lowe, and in this case it's exactly the same as what we did with The Bloke.
Someone soon
Your comment, John West?
There's a strong flavour of Canberra about the Sentimental Bloke. Its composer, Albert Arlen, lived there when he wrote the music for it. The book was the joint work of Mrs. Arlen, otherwise actress Nancy Brown, and Lloyd Thompson of the Australian Diplomatic Service, and its leading man, Edwin Ryde, also a diplomat, was encouraged after the show's world premiere in Canberra on March the 7th, 1961, to forsake diplomacy for the professional stage. The Bloke, like most successful shows, it gets referred to usually by a shortening of its real name, romped through no less than a 5-month Melbourne season following that Canberra world premiere, then went up to Brisbane and established new records there, and then came to Sydney for nearly 4 happy months in the middle of 1962. Honesty requires me to relate that it then went to New Zealand and came a horrifying cropper, but that's another story. My feeling is that the Sentimental Bloke deserved its success, for it was amiable in the extreme. The score had some nice tunes, and several of the performances were knockouts, in particular Gloria Dawn as Rose of the Pickle Factory. Frank Ward as Ginger Mick was also extremely good. Walton Harvey worked hard as the Strawat Coot, and Patsy Hemingway was Doreen. Edwin Ryde's all-too-recent admission to professional rank stood out rather in this company, but he certainly looked the part. Betty Pounder's choreography, particularly the two-up ballet, was first class. The programme said, "At last, Australia has its own long-run smash-hit musical success." And by golly, those words are very nearly true. Perhaps the day of the Australian musical comedy is really coming closer.
Well, the gaps between Australian musicals do seem to be getting shorter, although in this broadcast we've looked at only 4 representative shows. Nevertheless, it was 17 years from Collits Inn to the Highwayman, another 8 years to Lola Montez, then 3 more years to the Sentimental Bloke. Supposing there was at least one new Australian musical produced professionally every year, would there be a following for it? What do you think, Edmund Samuels?
There would be a following if they'd given them a chance to hear them and see them. There's no question about that at all. When you think that shows like South Pacific and those type of musicals, they've been running for years. It's only because they're presented properly. The thing is only as good as you produce it, irrespective of who the author might be. It's what the producer does with it that counts.
And Albert Arlen?
I'm certain that the Australian public will go to the shows, whether they're Australian or otherwise, if it's good entertainment. The Bloke seemed to be the entertainment that they were looking for at the time, and they responded. Another musical that I had done before the Sentimental Bloke was also an Australian subject, The Girl from the Snowy, and I produced that for the Canberra Repertory Society in Canberra, and that broke all records. It was an Australian subject, and they seemed to absolutely love it. So I'm certain that there is an audience for the Australian musical if it gives the public the entertainment they are looking for.
Well, who knows? Maybe Sydney and Melbourne will someday see premieres of new Australian musicals as often as imported shows. Indeed, we know of one that may be in the offing, don't we, Alan Burke?
Yes, we're doing an adaptation of The Harp in the South, Ruth Park's very famous novel. Ruth gave us permission to do this adaptation, and we've been working on it for some years now. There was a bit of a lapse in it in that I went overseas for a year and work stopped, but we have now finished it, and we're hoping that we might interest somebody in a production before the end of 1966.
That was a look at 4 Australian musical comedies with the voices of Barney Monk, Edmund Samuels, Alan Burke, and Albert Arlen. The interviewer was Glen Menzies. Critiques came from John West. Special music was recorded by Shirley Flesfader with Bill Higgins at the piano. And this program for Australia Day was narrated and produced in Perth by Charles Graham.